Good afternoon, everyone. So, to start off my literature review series, I wanted to dive into some calf training. I'm really big into calf training. I particularly have done a lot more of it over the past year or so. And it's an area that a lot of people like to say, oh, my calves just don't grow. And I think the statement is semi true. However, I don't think people put the same amount of volume or effort into training their calves. And this study, I think, shows that if you train your calves, you will see a increase in calf size. Now, there are some caveats to that we'll get into when we go look at the methodology, but this specific article is looking at different foot positioning during calf training to induce portion-specific gastrocnemius muscle hypertrophy. So they're trying to see if your feet pointed in, feet pointed out, or feet pointed forward, how it changes which areas of the gastroc grow, because the gastroc consists of two heads, your lateral, which is the outside of your calf, and the medial, which is the inside of your calf. To real quick note, their hypothesis was that the medial gastroc would uh, have a greater growth with feet pointed out. The lateral would have greater growth with feet pointed in. That was their main hypothesis. And for their methods, they had these individuals um, training 3 days a week. I believe full body, they don't explicitly say if it is full body, but based upon how they present the information, it is subjects performed seven exercises. So I anticipate, hang on, my cat is going to come eat trying to eat her sister's food. Um, they will, they had them performing 7 exercises. So I assume it means that they were going to do a 3 day a week full body exercises. And their calf training was yeah, train 3 times a week. In the first 3 weeks, they performed 3 sets per session, and then it was 4 sets per session from weeks 4 to 9. Now, one major area of their methodology that I was a little hesitant about is they were looking for individuals that have not been involved in resistance training over the last 4 months. Pardon my sticky note there that I can't move on my computer, but have at least 6 months of training, which raises the question, was there a retraining effect from this and during this protocol? Because when you go away and you have muscle atrophy, if you come back into exercise, you'll see muscle growth faster just because that muscle already grew, and we're not actually seeing growth per se. We're seeing more intracellular fluid, so the fluid inside the muscle. So that was my one caveat to that. And on top of it, and then my other piece is it gets a little weird when you have three protocols you're essentially testing, because there's only 2 legs to test. Uh, so you get a little bit of a different. You can't have essentially one foot that has foot out and then foot in. So you can't just compare those, because you're also doing foot forward, which is a traditional calf raise. So you get a little bit of a weird division of participants. And see, they had 16 with foot pointed out, 16 with foot pointed in, and 12 with foot pointed forward. Again, not a bad spread, but it is an odd way of going about it. Not bad. At least they're using. Uh, it just is tough to compare individuals because they're not all within subject for each one. And again, I actually thought the number of sets per week was pretty good. So you're looking at 9 to 12 sets per week, which I would expect to see some growth at that rep range. That's a set number of sets per week. Again, another thing they talk about a 1-1-2 tempo, which is a 1 second concentric, 1 second peak, and then 2 second eccentric phase with a really heavy focus on squeezing the muscle. This study is from 2020, so this is before this really high focus on eccentrics and the stretch, which is fine. But even in 2020, I don't think the squeeze of the muscle was necessarily considered more hypertrophic than the rest of the motion. So interesting that they have this concept of squeezing. I think it comes in later where we'll talk a little bit about it and I have more thoughts on it, is that they get really big into muscle activation for the in relation to hypertrophy and muscle growth, which is, and they even say it's not necessarily a great indicator of more or less hypertrophy. But let's talk about that in a moment. So overall methodology really good. Measurement of the gastroc is through ultrasound, which is fine. I think that in this instance it is a um, in this smaller, more, I'd say, early study, it is adequate. You mean they go on to say that they could use a CT scan or MRI scan for better measurements, but this I think is adequate. And so the results showed is that basically, if you train your calves are going to grow. They saw significant differences between pre and post measurements for all um, interventions and for both heads of the gastroc, but they only found significant differences between foot pointed in, foot pointed out for both instances. There is no statistical difference between foot pointed forward and either the other two during post hoc analysis. So after they saw that there's a statistical difference. So just talking about the results for a minute, again, if you look at these, they're really small differences because, again, you're not going to see a ton of hypertrophy in 9 weeks. But for 9 weeks, this is pretty good indications that if you train your calves with 9 to 12 sets a week, regardless of foot placement, your calves are likely to grow. And if you pay attention, again, like just essentially going in and training calves, it's going to help. Now, diving into some of their discussion, they start off the bat really talking about muscle activation and its relationship to, or muscle activation and its relation to hypertrophy. And they even go and say they don't measure surface level EMG in this study, but they're like, oh, but they kind of feel that muscle activation is really important for muscle growth, which is true. I mean, if your muscle's not active, your muscles aren't going to grow. And I think it's important to remember that if you could have a lot of muscle activation, but you could have not a lot of mechanical stress because as you do more reps, um, you fatigue different muscle fibers. And so some muscle fibers may no longer be as active as other ones. So you may not see a difference in muscle activation because some muscle fibers might no longer be able to fire because they're just fatigued and others take over. So, in that sense, muscle activation is not necessarily indicative of muscle growth in that sense. They do bring up the good point, though, that the greater activation of a given muscle compared with others involved during an exercise seem to indicate at least this muscle or portion is more likely to be hypertrophied than another. 100% agree with that. I think that's where surface level EMG is helpful because if you're doing an exercise and there's just no muscle activation at all, the likelihood of it actually growing is probably null. And again, this is me speaking off the cuff and not scientifically per se, but I don't think that we would see muscle growth if we're not, um, if you don't have any kind of activation. So they put a lot of, um, I think they put a lot more stock into muscle activation within this study in regards to muscle growth. And I agree to an extent. I don't think they're wrong. I think there's a multimodal aspect to muscle growth. The big piece for me was amount of range of motion and stretch that's placed based upon the foot placement. Because if you think about it, when your foot's pointed in, the medial head is going to stretch more as you come down. And same with the foot pointed out, you're going to see the lateral head stretched more because of where the insertions are on the back of your foot. Which, again, with the kind of the current literature, this is obviously old, so they probably would be talking more about this and be more in. I'm speaking like I know them, but I suspect they would talk a little bit more about this stretch aspect. I'm not going to sit here and put all my eggs in one basket. Oh, the stretch is the most important thing. I don't think that per se. I think that making sure that the muscle is under a large amount of mechanical tension through a wide range of motion is close to failure is what's likely going to drive muscle growth. And so changing the foot position makes sense. Again, they talk about ankle inversion and eversion, which again comes back to the earlier point of stretch as well, the range of motion. But they talk about the specific activation of the gastroc being impacted by ankle inversion, eversion. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily a key piece of this hypertrophy they saw. It's likely, again, it's likely part of it. I should not rule it out. I just, I don't put as much stock into muscle activation. I think that you should be able to feel the muscle when you're exercising. I think it's just a good mental cue to know that you're doing the right thing. I think you should feel the muscle fatiguing because that means it's working. That means it's being placed on a lot of mechanical tension. Those are the key pieces I think that could have been talked about a little bit more in here. However, I actually really like this study because it does take the take home points is you can potentially target specific hypertrophy of the different heads of the gastroc based upon your foot placement. Now, if anyone's ever actually tried changing foot placement for calf training, foot pointed in, foot pointed out are just wildly uncomfortable. I've done it before. When I was in college, I spent probably a month or so really just I'd hit foot pointed in for 2 sets, foot pointed out for 2 sets, really trying to target the specific muscles. And it's cool, it's a neat thing, but it's just wildly uncomfortable. I did not enjoy it, and I've seen good growth, good strength gains with just doing foot pointed forward. No, I am obviously not. This is N of one of me. But even in this study, if you look at their results, the differences between foot pointed forward and foot pointed inward for lateral, um, and foot pointed out for medial versus foot pointed forward, the differences are so negligible that if you are going to do 2 sets of foot pointed out and then 2 sets of foot pointed in for your calf training, the question arises, is it just better to just do 4 sets of foot pointed forward? I mean, if all things are equal, I'm curious if that is what they'd see. And again, they even talk about further studies needing to see how it works when you combine the two together. So it'd be really interesting to see if in a study, having one foot being foot pointed out for 2 sets, foot pointed out for 2 sets, foot pointed in for 2 sets, and then just 4 sets of foot pointed forward on one leg, and see what the differences in growth would be there. And then you can help determine if it's actually worth spending that extra time just splitting it up, or can you just go in and be like, I'm gonna hit 4 sets of calves and be done with it. Overall, this is a really good study, a really interesting study. The key takeaways are, I believe, and they even talk about it, is you can potentially target specific gastroc heads with the muscle activation. And if that's something that you really want to spend time on and you're interested in calf training like I am, I think that that's worth an effort. If you have the ability, I work out from home, and trying to do foot pointed in, foot pointed out would probably be a lot of extra bandwidth for myself. Um, so overall, really cool study, really interesting practical help of train your calves. If you want your calves to grow, you have to spend time training them. You can't be like, do 3 sets one time a week and be like, my calves don't grow. You should probably train them a couple times a week. This study shows 3 times a week, 3 sets each time. You'll see growth. I do 3 times, um, anywhere from 2 to 3 sets per week, and I see, so I've seen growth. So 10 out of 10 recommend training calves. If you want to target a specific head, give this a try. See if you like the foot positioning of foot pointed in or foot pointed out. And if you do, maybe that's worth experimenting with for yourself. If you don't like how it feels on your lower leg, at your hip, then just do foot pointed forward. It'll be interesting to try to go and find some more research on this. So, this is from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. The study is free. I'll link it below, and I will see you next time.